News to tell you about tonight. A Columbus father speaks out for the first time after the man who fatally shot his pregnant wife is punished. 25-year-old Tanisha Latham was pregnant when she was shot 4 times in the head in February of last year. Their baby survived, but as 10 TV's Jessica Goddard reports, the family says they too are serving a life sentence without their loved one.
Tanino Ferguson says life as she knew it ended on February 27, 2011.
Because of this coward act, this pathetic, useless, cold-hearted murderer, this monster.
Kiwan Connor fatally shot Tanisha Latham, 27 weeks pregnant at the time, after shooting her husband Larry in the head during a marijuana buy at the couple's home. Larry survived, and doctors were able to successfully deliver the couple's daughter, who they named Miracle.
You taking someone that can't be replaced by any other. Words can't express the void that my children have endured.
Connor, a man Larry called a lifetime friend he considered family, proclaimed his innocence to the court and our cameras.
There was no proof. There was nothing on me, man. Nothing. But one man saying me. Afterwards, I'm innocent.
Connor faced the death penalty for the crime, but the jury that convicted him recommended life in prison without parole.
I can't give you the death penalty because the jury didn't recommend it. That's all I can say.
In handing down his sentence, the judge imposed the maximum penalty on each count, life in
Most
prison.
of us feel like we have a pretty
46
solid
years.
handle on the American legal system.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we've all basically earned a law degree from the University of Primetime Television.
Right. That's a prestigious institution. I hear the tuition is just hours spent on the couch.
Exactly. You watch enough CSI, enough Law and Order, and you just internalize this certain rhythm. You assume there's always a fingerprint. There's always that DNA match that pops up on a giant screen.
With the big red message found flashing.
Yes. And everything gets wrapped up in 60 minutes flat.
It's a comforting thought, isn't it? That, science always points to the bad guy and our rights are all totally clear-cut. But when you actually start digging into legal scholarship, and especially real case files, you realize that TV law is basically a fantasy genre.
Which is exactly what we are unpacking today. We're shattering the illusion. We've got a really fascinating stack of sources to dive into. We're looking at these articles from the Ave Maria School of Law Moot Court Board Journal, which sounds a little dry, but I promise you it reads like a thriller.
It really does.
And we are pairing that with the case files from State v. Connor, which is this just brutal murder trial out of Ohio that completely flips the script on what we think counts as evidence.
Yeah, this whole deep dive is really a mission to decode the the legal fictions we all believe in. We're going to look at why your DNA might be at a crime scene you've never even been to, how the government can build a mosaic of your life without a warrant, and the incredibly twisted, ironic story of the man behind the Miranda rights.
Okay, so let's start with the big one, the CSI effect. I feel like this term gets thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean for a jury sitting in a box?
So the CSI effect is, it's essentially this expectation that jurors bring into the courtroom with them. They've seen the shows. They expect high-tech forensic science in every single case.
They want the 3D crime scene reconstruction.
They want the 3D reconstruction, the perfect DNA match. And when the prosecution doesn't have it, jurors are, way more likely to vote not guilty because they just assume the investigation was sloppy.
Right. They're thinking, well, on TV, they would have found a hair fiber, so why didn't you?
Exactly. But what's so interesting about our sources is they suggest that this reliance on forensics might be, well, it might be misplaced. The science isn't as magical as we think.
Okay, so this brings us to DNA. We think of it as the absolute gold standard, the finger of God. If your DNA is on the murder weapon, you held the murder weapon. End of story.
But the source material highlights this concept called secondary transfer that it completely complicates that whole narrative.
This was the part that honestly kind of freaked me out. This is the handshake study, right? Can you walk us through how this worked?
It's terrifyingly simple. Researchers did a study where person A shakes hands with person B. Just a normal, maybe slightly long 2-minute handshake.
Okay.
Then they separate. Person B and only person B goes over and picks up a knife.
So just to be clear, person A never touches the knife, never even sees it.
Correct. But when they swabbed that knife, they found person A's DNA on it 85% of the time.
Wait. 85%. So I shake your hand, you go pick up a weapon, and suddenly my DNA is on a weapon I never laid a finger on.
That's it. And it gets even worse.
Yeah.
In some of those cases, the quote-unquote innocent person's DNA was the primary profile found on the weapon.
That is just wild. So if you're a juror and you see a lab report that says the defendant's DNA was the main profile on the handle, you'd convict. You wouldn't even think twice.
You wouldn't, but the science is telling us that DNA travels. It's volatile. It flies through the air when we talk. It transfers through touch. So just because your DNA is there, it doesn't mean you're there.
And it's not just DNA. The sources also took a shot at fingerprints. I mean, I always thought fingerprints were the one thing you couldn't fake. Unique like snowflakes. Irrefutable proof.
They are unique, that's true. But the analysis of them is human. The sources cite this one study showing that 1 in 5 fingerprint examiners have made false positives.
1 in 5. That's 20%.
That's a 20% error rate in that study, yeah. In the real world, prints are smudged, they're partial, they're distorted. It's almost never that perfect 10-point match you see on some TV screen. It's an art as much as a science, and, well, humans make mistakes.
Which brings us right to the case of State v. Connor. This was a reality check, because this was a death penalty case, a horrific crime, and yet it had none of that CSI stuff.
No, none of it. This was back in 2011 in Columbus, Ohio. The victims were Larry and Tanisha Latham. And it's just a heartbreaking story. Tanisha was 7 months pregnant.
And the details are just so senseless. A guy named Kiwan Connor comes to their door. Laurie Latham knows him. He thinks of him as family, even calls him nephew. So he lets him in.
Right. They go to the back to do a small deal, buying some marijuana. And then all of a sudden, the dynamic just shifts. Connor pulls a gun. He shoots Larry in the head. Point blank. And miraculously, Larry survives the headshot. But Connor then turns the gun on Tanisha. He kills her. The doctors were able to deliver the baby via an emergency C-section, a little girl they named Miracle, but Tanisha didn't make it.
So you've got a surviving witness, Larry, who says Kiwan Connor did this. But when the police scoured the scene, what do they actually find?
Physically, nothing. Nothing linking Connor to the murders. No gun was ever recovered. No DNA profile matching Connor was found anywhere. No fingerprints. I mean, if you were watching this on TV, the defense attorney would be doing a victory lap.
And that's exactly what the defense argued. They said, where's the evidence? They played that CSI card, and they played it hard. They even had an alibi. Connor claimed he was with his girlfriend.
But here's where real law beats TV law. The court upheld the conviction. And why? Because you don't actually need a lab report to get a life sentence. You just need a credible witness. Larry Latham survived, and he testified, I know who shot me. I let him in my house.
And there was also that jailhouse informant, wasn't there? A guy named Kelly Johnson.
That's right. Johnson testified that Connor told him in jail, no witness, no case. Connor apparently said he wished he'd made sure Larry was dead.
No witness, no case. That's so chilling because he was almost right.
He was incredibly close to being right. That testimony plus Larry's identification was enough. It sent Connor away for life without parole. It just proves that for all the CSI effect, the human element testimony, credibility, that's still the bedrock of the whole system.
Speaking of technology, let's pivot to how the government uses tech to watch us outside of a crime scene.
Yeah.
We're moving from physical evidence to surveillance.
This is why we get into what's called the mosaic theory. It's a fascinating legal concept that's really trying to play catch up with modern technology.
Okay, so the basic question here is, if a cop watches me drive down a public street, is that a search? Do they need a warrant?
Historically, no. The answer is no. You're in public. You have no reasonable expectation of privacy on a public road. Anyone can see you.
Right. But what if they use a GPS tracker or a drone and they watch me every single day for a month?
And that is where the mosaic comes in. The theory goes that while one single trip to the grocery store is public, that's like one little tile in a mosaic, the aggregate of all your movements over 4 weeks, that creates a comprehensive picture of your life.
The sum is greater than its parts.
Exactly. If I watch you for a month, I don't just see you driving. I see you go to a psychiatrist every Tuesday. I see the political rallies you attend. I see who you're sleeping with. That aggregate mosaic reveals your life in a way a single glance never could.
The source material had a great example with the drone to explain this.
Right. So imagine 2 deputies go on vacation to the Bahamas for 3 weeks. But before they go, they park a drone over your backyard, just recording 24/7. Now, technically, your backyard might be visible from a plane flying over, but that constant automated surveillance creates a privacy invasion that a one-time flyover just doesn't.
It's getting so much harder to define what public even means.
Yeah.
And then there's social media. The sources make a great point that we all just voluntarily give up our privacy online, but that it creates a total nightmare for evidence.
Oh, it does. It creates what they call an authentication gap. Let's say there's a Facebook post from your account that threatens someone or confesses to a crime. It looks like a smoking gun, right?
But in court, you have to prove I was the one who typed it.
Precisely. How do you prove the defendant actually touched the keys? It could be hacking. It could be fraping, where friends prank each other. Or you just left your phone unlocked on a table at a party.
The source used this really specific visual of negative filter images to talk about this.
Yes, those images of crowds where people are just these outlines, negative space. It's a perfect metaphor for the digital world. We know the account John Doe posted the threat, but we can't see the face behind the screen. If the prosecution can't prove you were the one holding the phone, that evidence might just get tossed out.
It feels like we're in this weird limbo where the law is just desperately trying to catch up to the fact that we all carry tracking devices in our pockets.
And it's not just our pockets, it's our bodies. The sources get into the backscatter machines at airports, the body scanners.
Oh, I hate those things. You have to stand there with your hands up like you're under arrest.
And maybe for good reason. The source argues this is a direct conflict with the Fourth Amendment. The Ket standard says we have a reasonable expectation of privacy when it comes to our bodies. But these machines produce what are, essentially nude images of every passenger.
But the justification is safety, right? I don't want people bringing weapons on planes either.
Yeah. They call it an administrative search. The logic is that it's for air travel safety, not a criminal investigation. But the legal scholars in our stack, they argue that this is a distinction without a difference. Because if those machines detect something that leads to criminal charges like drugs, it's really a warrantless search for evidence without probable cause.
It's just this massive gray area that we've all sort of accepted as the price of flying. It makes you think about what rights we actually have versus what rights we think we have, which actually leads us perfectly to the story of Miranda.
You have the right to remain silent. It's the most famous sentence in legal history.
And I think most people just assume it's always been there, like it's written right into the Constitution.
Yeah.
But it was incredibly controversial when it first came out.
Oh, hugely controversial. In the late 60s, Richard Nixon literally ran for president attacking the Miranda decision. He said it was weakening the peace forces. The public felt the Supreme Court was handcuffing the police and letting criminals walk on technicalities.
But the irony, and this is the part of the deep dive that really, really stuck with me, is the story of Ernesto Miranda himself, the man the law is named after.
It is a tragedy of almost Shakespearean proportions. So Ernesto Miranda was a career criminal. He was the plaintiff in that famous Supreme Court case. But years later, in 1976, he was in this dive bar in Phoenix called The Deuce.
Sounds like a rough spot.
A very rough spot. He gets into an argument over a card game. A fight breaks out, and Miranda is stabbed to death.
Okay, so the guy who gives us the right to remain silent gets killed. But what happened to the killer?
The police caught a suspect. They had the guy. And, following the law, the officer pulls out a card and reads him his Miranda rights.
No way.
The suspect listened. And he chose to remain silent. He didn't confess. And because there wasn't enough other evidence to hold him without that confession, he was released.
That is, wow. Ernesto Miranda's killer went free because he used the very right that Ernesto Miranda established.
It's the ultimate irony. But it also proves the system works, in a way. The law is neutral. It doesn't care about irony. It protects the person accused of killing the man who created the protection.
There are just so many of these little nuances where the law doesn't work the way you'd think. Like the DUI stuff and the sources, this whole implied consent thing.
Right. Most states say that just by driving on their roads, you imply consent to a sobriety test. But the Supreme Court in Birchfield v. North Dakota drew a really interesting line.
This is the difference between breath and blood, isn't it?
Exactly. They said you can be compelled to take a breath test. That's just capturing air you're exhaling anyway. It's not that invasive. But a blood draw, that involves piercing your skin. That is a bodily intrusion.
So if I'm unconscious after a crash, the cops can't just stick a needle in my arm.
Not without a warrant or what they call exigent circumstances, like an emergency where they can't wait. The source makes it clear that implied consent does not cover sticking a needle in an unconscious person. It's a win for privacy, but it definitely complicates DUI investigations.
And then there's the one relationship we all think is totally sacred, attorney-client privilege. You see it in movies all the time. I can tell you I killed him, and you can't tell anyone.
And that part is true. But there's a rogue client exception. The source details a scenario where a client actually threatens their own lawyer.
Like, if you don't win this case, I'm going to hurt you.
Exactly that. If a client says, if you don't fix this, I'll kill you, that communication is not privileged. It's a crime in progress. The lawyer can, and absolutely should, testify against the client about that threat. The privilege is a shield for defense, not a sword to threaten your own counsel.
It's just fascinating how all these supposedly absolute rights have these little trapdoors. But I want to shift gears to the human cost of all this, because we've talked a lot about theory, but for people caught in the gears of the system, it's not theoretical at all.
And nowhere is that clearer than in domestic violence cases. The sources really dig into the difficulty of prosecuting when the victim recants their story.
We saw that example of Diana Clark, which is obviously a pseudonym. She tells the police her husband stabbed her, gives a full detailed statement. But then, at trial, she completely flips. She says she stabbed herself in a fit of self-destruction.
And this happens all the time. Victims are scared, they're financially dependent, they're pressured by family. The legal system tries to fix this with something called excited utterances.
That sounds like an indie band name. What is it, legally?
Basically, the hearsay rule usually stops prosecutors from using out-of-court statements. But if you say something in the heat of the moment, like right after the stabbing while you're still bleeding and hysterical, the law assumes you can't be lying because you haven't had time to invent a lie.
So the prosecutor can use the 911 call or the police body cam footage, even if she refuses to testify.
They try to. But the Supreme Court threw a big wrench in that with the Crawford decision. It says a defendant has a right to confront their accuser. If the victim's statement was testimonial, meaning it was given to police to help build a case, it might be inadmissible if the victim doesn't show up to court. So abusers often walk free, specifically because they've successfully intimidated the victim into silence.
It's complete catch-22. The more scared the victim is, the harder it is to convict the abuser.
Precisely. And speaking of vulnerable people, we have to talk about juveniles. The sources were really critical of Florida's direct file statute.
This is about trying kids as adults.
Yes.
Yeah.
Florida transfers more children to adult court than any other state. And under direct file, it's often not a judge who makes that decision, it's the prosecutor.
That feels like a massive conflict of interest. The prosecutor wants a conviction, and it's easier to get a harsh sentence in adult court.
That's the argument. And the stats seem to back up the problem. Kids who are sent to adult prison have much higher recidivism rates. They're more likely to commit crimes again than kids kept in the juvenile system. Adult prison is about punishment. Juvenile detention is supposed to be about rehabilitation. When you mix a 16-year-old with hardened adult criminals, you aren't fixing the problem, you're usually cementing it.
And it's not just the defendants who are part of the problem. Sometimes it's the prosecutors themselves. We had to talk about the Brady rule.
This is a cornerstone of fairness. Brady v. Maryland says prosecutors they must turn over any evidence that helps the defendant. If they find a witness who says he didn't do it, they can't just hide that. They have to give it to the defense.
But the sources bring up the case of Senator Ted Stevens. He was convicted, but it turned out the prosecutors hid evidence that would have cleared him. He was exonerated eventually, but his career was totally ruined.
And here is the really scary part. The source argues that the courts are actually powerless to punish those prosecutors.
Wait, how's that possible? They broke the law.
The argument is based on the separation of powers. The judiciary, the judges, has the power of judgment. But the executive branch, the prosecutors, has the power of the sword of enforcement. The source argues that a judge cannot hold a federal prosecutor in criminal contempt for a Brady violation because that would be the judiciary trying to wield the executive's power.
So who polices the prosecutors?
Ideally, the Department of Justice polices itself.
Which doesn't sound very reassuring.
It isn't. It offers very little comfort to someone sitting in a cell because evidence was hidden. It really highlights this structural weakness in our system of checks and balances.
This brings us right back to where we started. We have all these high-level theories, mosaic theory, Miranda, Brady, direct file. But at the end of the day, looking back at State v. Connor, it all came down to one single thing: a jury believing Larry Latham.
That really is the synthesis here. You can have all the constitutional arguments in the world, but the justice system is just fundamentally human. In State v. Connor, there was no DNA, there was no weapon, there was just a man saying, "I know who shot me," and a jury deciding to believe him.
And the human toll is what lingers. We talk about case law, but Tanisha Latham lost her life. A baby, miracle, was born into this tragedy. Larry Latham has to live with the memory of opening that door.
The law is an imperfect attempt to balance fairness with justice. It requires us to let some guilty people go, like Ernesto Miranda's killer, to protect the rights of everyone else. And sometimes it requires us to just trust a human voice over a lab report.
It's a heavy realization. I know the next time I'm watching a crime show and the detective pulls a perfect fingerprint off a rainy window and gets a match in 3 seconds, I'm just going to be yelling at the screen.
As you should be, because in the real world, DNA transfers with a handshake. Suspects go free because of rights they didn't even know they had. And sometimes, a memory is the only evidence that matters.
Keep diving deep and read the fine print.
Always read the fine print.